Nous allons tout de suite attaquer notre dernière table
Now we're going
ronde.
to move on immediately to our last roundtable discussion, which addresses a topical subject, is one sort of demographic transitions and social protection. As you know, COVID has been a bit of a paradox for social coverage. We've never spent so much, had so much public spending in the past, and we see there's been a major change in attitudes, but also we've seen this equally in many countries, and in G20 countries, this COVID situation combined with aging has led to inequalities that are becoming sharper. So we're going to look, maybe take a naive stance and ask the question, is COVID an opportunity to become aware of what UN was saying that was essential in 1945? That was the necessity to have access to healthcare, universal healthcare. And with this virus that has caused many deaths, but it is a virus that has raised this question of healthcare, and it is a dramatic pandemic, but in spite of its gravity, is something that has really developed awareness of the need for universal health care, and also has made us really aware of the importance of the health of one's neighbor. So to answer this question, we have a prestigious panel with Olivier AZUARA, Jean BUKHMAN, Alexandre CALLENS, Ousseynou and Guy Valenciennes, and Madame RAZAVI.
Really need to start here is that in a number of low and middle income countries, national health insurance or national health service system has not yet reached, as we know, universal coverage, and consequently access to healthcare without financial hardship is not a given. It's not something we can assume is there. This affects particularly people of all ages whose livelihoods are reliant on the informal economy. And the picture in low-income countries is the most worrying when it comes to older persons. Now, some countries, some low and middle-income countries have put in place free care programs, but these usually focus on pregnant women and children under 5, which de facto excludes older persons. Now, some countries have limited social health insurance programs, but those are usually not open for workers in the informal economy. And some of those programs are also disconnected when employment stops and no pension system follows. And the situation is really inequitable for older people in countries where there is no universal coverage of health benefits and pensions alike. So for healthcare, they need to pay out of pocket, but on top of it, older persons also have little source of income or financial autonomy. And while there's little data on out-of-pocket payments by age group, divided by age, the study on global aging, which is called SAGE, which was conducted by WHO in China, Ghana, India, Mexico, and the Russian Federation and South Africa, showed that catastrophic healthcare spending affected between 8 to nearly 46% of older persons who had responded to this questionnaire. And this has an important impact in terms of effective access. Many older persons forego care. They don't go and seek healthcare, which was estimated between 21% of persons, older persons in Mexico, to 48% in South Africa, who even when they're ill, they don't seek healthcare. And it further impacts on the health status of older persons. For example, those with chronic conditions such as high blood pressure, etc. Now, and even in places where access to healthcare without hardship is relatively well covered, the current health systems and health benefit packages are not necessarily suited to respond to the needs of older persons because of their focus on curative care and interventions and very low focus on chronic conditions, because of the high focus on hospital care and low adaptation to procedures to foster functional maintenance of people. So older persons come out of hospitalization with even worse mobility than when they went in, and also the high focus on hospital care and very low investment in primary care and in the kind of long-term care that is needed within the community. And of course, low focus on prevention over the life cycle, which affects and compounds the situation of older persons. And let me also just highlight a few other points that I wanted to say, not so much about healthcare, but also about income security, because that is also absolutely key. And as we know, in a number of countries, in developing countries at least, we know that access to even a basic income for when people are retired and old is not, again, a given. We have global data which shows that close to 1/3 of the world's population, older population, that is 65 years and older, is still not receiving an old age pension. And effective coverage is huge. The gap is almost 75% in both sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia, i.e. 75% of people 65 years and above don't have access to a pension. So only a small minority do. And also this access to benefits is closely associated, as we know, with inequalities in the labor market. And people who work informally, people who have interrupted careers, that means very often women, their chances of having a pension from a contributory system is much lower than people who work in the formal economy, people who have a continuous employment without interruptions, for example, due to caregiving, which often affects women. So all of these factors mean that women often end up, in particular, in a difficult situation from contributory systems. And of course, the design of the system also makes a big difference. If there are efforts to extend coverage by strengthening the redistributive mechanisms within the system, then women fare relatively better. And if there are mechanisms within pension systems like a care credit, that values and gives credit for periods in one's life when one is doing caregiving, then again, women tend to benefit from that. And also when there are mechanisms for periodic adjustment of the value of the benefit, you know, for example, by having indexation that links the value of the benefit, the size of the benefit to inflation or to the general level of income, then people who live longer, and that means very often women disproportionately, they fare better because the value of the pension doesn't get eroded over time. And these kind of adaptations, I think, are particularly important. But the really important point I want to emphasize, or two to end with, one is that while non-contributory pensions, or social pensions as they are called, have done well in terms of giving more women access to at least a basic pension, and the role of non-contributory schemes is very important in contexts with a lot of people working in the informal economy. There are issues around the adequacy of the benefits that come from social pensions, or minimum pensions as they are called, because this level is often very low and doesn't meet the full basic needs that older people have, and it cannot compensate for the lack of having access to a contributory benefit. For example, in countries like India, Colombia, and Turkey, the non-contributory benefit system, the pension system, is less than 40% of the national poverty line. So that's the first point I wanted to make, the importance of having things like non-contributory benefits, but also making sure that they reach a minimum threshold. And secondly, it's really important that social protection systems come with investments in care services so that women have access to, for example, childcare services so that they can join the labor market, stay in the labor market longer, particularly in what ILO calls decent jobs so that they have a decent pension at the end of their careers. But also we need more investments in long-term care services. And this is something that the crisis, the COVID crisis has made particularly clear, even in countries where there are long-term care services, where the quality hasn't been good, where people who work in long-term care are not given decent jobs, good working conditions, access to social protection. And older women, much more than older men, are likely to live alone because they tend to marry people who are older than they are. So men in their old age tend to have someone in the family to take care of them, usually their partners, but that's not the case for older women. And so they're very much dependent on being residents of care homes in countries where care homes exist. So they particularly lose out where the quality of that care is not good. And also in developing countries, there's not a very good assumption to say that families take care of people, because we know many older people are living on their own and are often not taken care of, even when they live with family members who themselves have jobs and many other duties. So in short, investments in care services, childcare and long-term care services, public services that are accessible, that are affordable, and that have good quality is a really important lesson that we must take out of this crisis. We cannot assume that people can go on and women can go on giving care indefinitely without any kind of support and without adequate services. And I think investment in those services is something that we really need to do as we emerge from this crisis and move on. And for governments who are concerned about generating employment, well, care services do generate employment. This is what has been a major engine of employment generation in the Nordic countries. And there are also many countries in the South that have started making those investments. And I think continuing those investments as we emerge from this crisis can be very important in terms of creating employment and letting the economy also emerge out of the crisis and create jobs. So it really brings multiple benefits. Thank you very much.
Merci, Shahrashoub. C'était très intéressant.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Mrs. RAZAVI is in charge of social protection at the Work International Organization. Before that, we had a lecture from Tricia Convoy from Help Page International, and Tricia said pretty much the same thing. So I'm sorry that we are not able to actually speak with Tricia or Shahrashoub, but our roundtable is not only with the male guests, since we have Natalie who has joined us. Jean Bachman, perhaps we could start with you. Jean Bachman is a Harvard professor. He has issued in autumn remarkable article about the universal health coverage and about the idea that maybe there's a need to change the WHO software that is and focusing on young generation in order to relaunch, rephrasing into the speaker, the ambition of the UN back in 1945 and also the conference in 1980, insisting on the need for access to primary health care in many countries, and such a trend should be extended. Jean, over to you.
À prolonger. Jean, s'il vous plaît.
Yeah, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, François-Xavier. Javier. I'm going to speak in English, I think, because I think it'll be better that way. But it's great to be joining this Francophone group, and it's exciting to engage. I think that there's obviously not as much conferences that have this kind of joint Anglophone Francophone conversation, and so this is very attractive about being able to speak with you all. I think as the organizers were mentioning, the last 5 years or so, I was working on a project with colleagues around the world, some 300 people, on looking specifically at the world's poorest billion population, those living in extreme poverty, and what was the nature of the non-communicable disease burden in that population. And the reason why we undertook that project was that, as you know, historically, the term non-communicable disease has a certain kind of popular meaning that's been constructed through the World Health Organization, through the United Nations system, through through other kinds of discourses that basically is around cardiometabolic disease in older populations, right? It's a people imagine what is non-communicable disease. They think largely, for the most part, of hypertension, diabetes, and associated lifestyle risk factors, tobacco, lack of physical activity, and then aging really as being a major driver, and urbanization, those kinds of things. And historically, if you look at what the effect of that framing has been, particularly since the United Nations high-level meeting and even earlier, but in beginning in 2011, is that it's essentially, from what you can see, has stopped any kind of growth in development assistance for health. We saw with the HIV movement in the UN high-level meeting on HIV in 2001. A real enormous growth in development assistance for health, something on the order, just from HIV, probably of an additional 10 billion annually. And following the United Nations high-level meeting in 2011, there's been a real flatlining of development assistance for health. And the way that that whole picture of NCDs has been framed has been really brought into the way it's represented in universal health coverage, I would say, as well, and through the Sustainable Development Goal era, that essentially these are, preventable lifestyle diseases that are largely associated with aging and with development. And the policy response to that has been, to focus on prevention, focusing on the risk factors themselves, and to some minimal degree, maybe on treatment of high blood pressure, cardiovascular risk. When you look at, what are the real asks from the United Nations system, from what they call the best buys, or what the budget for this kind of strategy was laid out in 2011. It's largely focused on cholesterol drugs and high blood pressure drugs and things like that to manage cardiovascular risk. And so what we are seeing is that if you look at the traditional population that's been the focus of global humanitarian assistance, global solidarity, that the United Nations, that's really dependent on the United Nations system. These are the populations living in extreme poverty that are largely in rural sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And what we were seeing, I'm a physician and a medical anthropologist by training, and working with colleagues in rural Africa, a lot of us were seeing that, you have a very young population. And you have a lot of diseases that I think as was said, would naturally kind of fall in this commitment minimally to care of children under 5, women of childbearing age. There's a large number of diseases that are not communicable in that space, and they include all kinds of diseases, things like sickle cell disease, hemoglobinopathies. All of the musculoskeletal diseases, some of which are very severe, rheumatoid arthritis, all of the gastrointestinal conditions, including many of the surgical conditions, appendicitis, congenital conditions like children being born with hydrocephalus, pressure in their heads that requires release through surgical procedure. And even within, the traditional kind of cardiovascular diseases like rheumatic heart disease and cardiomyopathies, or for the cancers, the cancers affecting children, women, women's cancers, that obviously don't really fit in that kind of framework of the cardiometabolic lifestyle disease. And so, we quantified how big that gap was. This was actually the largest gap in terms of financing for universal health coverage for the poor, that development assistance wasn't really addressing this, and that about half of the burden is actually falling on populations under age 40. So from a policy perspective and how we think about universal health coverage, particularly for the world's poorest billion people, it has huge implications because it's basically saying this is the largest issue in universal health coverage. It's been misrepresented. It's going to require external financing to meet this gap or to address this gap in the same way that we take seriously, tuberculosis or HIV or major causes of maternal child death, and that we need to bring it into that space. I think here in this panel, it's interesting to think about the implications for aging and the way that NCDs and aging, the discourse is very close together. And this in a way is sort of showing the other side of this, which is that there's a significant NCD issue in the younger populations. And there's a way in which at every level, there's a risk of the NCD agenda in older populations making invisible this kind of NCD agenda for the young. And we really struggled with this from an ethical perspective in the Commission, in the sense of priority setting. How much in these populations priority do you put on loss of health, loss of life at an early age, and how much do you emphasize that above, in addition to cost effectiveness? Because it may be that there's a lot of interventions that are cost effective, at older ages, maybe for hypertension even, or for example. But is there a special priority to loss of life at early ages? Is there a special priority to extended disability over the course of life? And this is something that I think where the NCD agenda really brings this up, because in the infectious and maternal child health, we've implicitly really prioritized the young in global health, and in NCDs we've implicitly prioritized older populations globally. And so this is sort of offering a challenge to this question. And I hope we can discuss this more on this panel today.
Merci. Excusez-moi, c'était passionnant. Merci.
Right, thank you. That was really very interesting, and we'll come back to that question. Maybe I will ask Oliver AZUARA, who has joined us, to respond. Oliver works is a senior economist for the InterAmerican Bank of Development, and he works on the social security and labor markets. And maybe he could also explain what he does. He works with Mr. Villarreal and the network that has been set up in Mexico. So Oliver, maybe you could say a few words and explain what the situation is in Latin America, both striking the right balance for pensions and access to healthcare. Oliver, over to you.
François-Xavier. Let me start with this. This pandemic has shown that around 60% of the total population, or in the labor age, is informal, which means the funding of social security health systems depend entirely on the functioning of the labor markets. And what this has shown is, or the pandemic of 2020 has shown, is that the labor markets or the segmentation of the labor markets show that millions of people are in danger because they are not fully covered against many risks. So in the case of Latin America, this number is around 60%. And before the pandemic, there were some issues or structural problems regarding productivity and informality that were already showing the importance of changes, or to change the functioning of the social security and the funding of healthcare system. There were many economic and fiscal and demographic imbalances, and the pandemic put more stress on these imbalances. And actually, contrary to what happened in other crises, in Latin America, this one pushed many people out of the labor force. So in general, when the financial crisis occurred in the past in Latin America, many people decided to abandon the formal labor market and go to the informal labor market. In this case, many, given the nature of the pandemic, they are going out from the labor market, so they are basically not covered. And what I think the lesson learned from this situation that we are living now is that we need to reimagine the functioning of the social security as an entire system. For many countries where the reality of the labor markets is different than it happened in Europe or in the US. It is important to think about how to reconfigure the formation of human capital to respond to or to create better labor markets, and also to find ways to recover more jobs to fund more efficiently the functioning of the social security. By June of this year, 29 million people lost their jobs in Latin America, and we're currently about 25 million, and we don't see what's going to be the end of this. So even if the pandemic is over, we will see that many of these jobs are not going to be recovered in many of these households, or the millions of households are not going to be effectively covered against health issues. Also, well, and in the other hand, we are living demographic transformation in the region, and we'll see that over the next 2 or 3 decades, and the acceleration of the old age process is going to be huge in Latin America. So we're going to face an old age process that took place in Europe for 70 years, and in Latin America and the Caribbean is going to take about 25 years. So the challenges are going to be huge. We need to find ways to convince firms to invest in social security, to have a better coverage of all risks that are insured by the social security.
Oui. Comment vous voyez la situation dans l'avenir proche alors? Comment vous voyez évoluer la situation dans l'avenir proche?
Well, in the near future, at least for Latin America, it's going to take on, as in other parts of the world, we'll see that how effective the vaccine is going to work, and we'll see people going back to the labor market. But now we need to find ways to at least separate the coverage of the health coverage separated from the labor market. I think the COVID has shown that it's really important just to take or separate the funding of the health systems from the labor situation of workers, because it's at the end you are segmenting the coverage also, and it's at least many countries have realized that it will be really important to find general funding sources of the health systems to provide effective coverage for the entire population. And based on that separation or this funding source, it's gonna the redefinition of the social security will take different forms in all the countries. So it will be important to separate the pension part, with all the pillars, the non-contributory pillars and the contributory pillars that are complement to each other, and for the health part to the coverage of more risks are going to be will probably come from the contributory part, but at least everybody has the same coverage, at least, or an homogeneous coverage for the entire population. The basic coverage, I think, will be more efficient to provide it with a general source instead of just thinking of the labor status funding a different system. At the end, if you have 60% of your labor force not contributing to the system, you are spending money from other sources to provide them with the basic healthcare coverage. So I'll say it's a matter of numbers and funds, just to realize that it will be important just to rethink this, separate the or try to find alternatives for funding, and not only use the typical contributory systems. I think technology in the past, it was something that responded to the example provided by other countries. But in the case of Latin America, I will say the reality is different. The markets are segmented, so it'll be really important just to facilitate the contributions. And I think technology in this case will be an ally. And they can, at least you can have or track everybody using or trying to pay for the contributions needed to fund a universal system.
Merci beaucoup, Oliver. C'est absolument
Thank you
passionnant.
so much. It was fascinating. We'll come back to what you have just described. Ousseynou, you are a gerontologist, physicist based in Senegal. Diop has worked in Senegal, as he said in a previous interview. He's worked in Senegal and in Rwanda. What is the situation in Senegal, and how do you respond to all the questions that are raised within this panel discussion? And thank you, by the way, for being with us. Well, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, we can. Well, thank you. Thank you for having us to this panel discussion, just to talk about this question of social protection and demographic transition, and to have a chance to present the African situation, which is totally different. And when we talk about the COVID pandemic and COVID crisis, it has shown indeed the urgency to set up a social protection that would be fair at all ages. Regarding the demographic transition now, Africa is not spared by the changes in population, even though the population is very young. It is a process that is not that is multifaceted, because aging is quite developed in North Africa, but it is just about to start in East and West Africa, like Senegal. It hasn't started in Central Africa. In Africa, the growth of old people will be the fastest growth. And WHO said that in 2050, that it is only in 2050 that the aging process will start in Africa. But what matters here is that in Senegal, in particular in Senegal, we are aging in the context of poverty. If in developed countries, developed countries became rich before getting old, but African countries are developing and they will get old before they get rich. So the aging process there will take place in a situation of poverty. And what we have observed in all these studies conducted is that the aging and retirement are factors of poverty. And in Senegal, the age range that is most indebted is between 55 and 65 years old. In addition to this, these are populations that are still breadwinners for their families. And when we talk about demographic transitions, that implies an epidemiological transition, as Jean BUKHMAN just said. All people would be faced with diseases and disease, chronic, non-transmittable, communicable diseases, blood pressure, diabetes, cancers, and so on and so forth. But it is quite paradoxical, because these diseases are very costly, and they will be responsible for this loss of autonomy of these people, and they will even worsen the situation of poverty, because that will increase huge expenses in terms of health care for these families. That's why in Senegal and in Africa in general, old people are vulnerable in different dimensions: economic, health, cultural vulnerability, and social vulnerability. And because of the precarious situation for many of these old people, they therefore need proper social protection. And I think it is important to talk and define what social protection means. In developed countries, social protection is a whole set of public policies in order to help individuals take care themselves, this definition does not apply to Africa because it is too limited for Africa, where poverty reigns and a big part of the population does not have access to basic services. And such a definition makes people believe that social protection exclusively depends on public policies. But in our African countries, in addition to public policies, there are informal systems as well. And it all depends on community and family solidarity. And these are not part of the definition that is used by developed countries. So that means that social protection goes way beyond the framework of public policies in Africa. So the problem in Africa is about funding for the social protection. And in most African countries, social protection is very little funded. There's no money for this because it is not considered as a priority for most African countries that are faced with other priorities, like access to basic needs, access to education, to water, and so on and so forth. Even though in most African countries, authorities set up universal medical coverage systems or health universal systems, but such systems are mainly focusing on the protection of mothers and children. Free C-sections or you name it. What we should bear in mind also is that in Senegal, and generally speaking in Africa, 84% of the population works in the informal sector and therefore has no social protection. And when we consider all people, 80% of all people in Africa do not receive any pension, any benefit. So, health coverage in Africa reaches perhaps 15 to 60% of the population. So for only 50% of the African population is indeed covered by proper health protection system. And fortunately, if I may say so, fortunately, the family plays a very important role. It is the family that plays the role of social security, if you like. But the family is now faced with difficulties linked to the spreading of the family or urbanizations, and mostly because of young people unemployment. So the direct payment of health expenses are catastrophic, are a disaster that even worsen the situation of poor families. That is why our authorities set up social assistance policies for the benefit of the have-not and most underprivileged populations. So can public policies substitute to the family solidarity? Well, that is a question that is raised. Because who is going to fund these public policies? That's the question. And even the people who received pensions, receive very little money. So these people cannot take care of themselves. And these people really cannot fund properly their health care. So these are people, instead of taking care of their free time and leisure activity, have to keep on working just to generate additional fund and to be able to support the family. And the second big challenge is to ensure a sustainable pension system. In Senegal and in Africa, there are financial difficulties because our retirement system is based on solidarity. But we observe that there are fewer participants when the number of recipients, potential recipients, is increasing because these people live longer. So we'll need to pay for a very long period of time. And that question and challenges this system, the pay-as-you-go system. So we were asked to consider this pay-as-you-go system, and therefore we thought that the capitalization system needed to be studied because population do not even do not even have access to basic services. So these are poor populations. How can they contribute? This capitalization system that is proposed may worsen social inequalities. And one last thing about women, maybe old women in particular. Most old women in Africa and in Senegal in particular have no social protection. In fact, women are amongst the poorest, and unfortunately, their basic needs are not considered by public policies. And I listened to what was said this morning. What to do then to value the experience of older people so that younger people can make the most of this experience, especially regarding the intergenerational relationships. Well, in Senegal, we've set up the National Council of Old People in addition to other institutions just to ensure this intergenerational dialogue. And the COVID pandemic, has been important because it has mostly impacted older people because of a problem of comorbidities, of access to healthcare. And in Senegal and in Africa in general, old people do suffer from these protective measures, especially what we call social distancing, which has led to isolation and to a feeling of solitude. Therefore, my question is, when there will be a vaccine in Africa, I'm just wondering if old people will not be forgotten and sacrificed somehow. And as a conclusion, what to do then to live up to this dual challenge, to meet young people's needs, but also meet older people's needs? Because that number will increase. So what to do? Should we set up a minimum level of protection? Should we have an indexation of pensions? But such a social protection must be properly funded. And in Africa, funding is insufficient because it covers only 15% of the population. And even when there is a protection, the protection is not as good as it should be. That's why we should have proper funding, because social protection definitely is a lever to economic development. Thank you.
Merci, docteur. C'était passionnant, comme à chaque fois que vous intervenez parmi nous.
Thank you. It's really very interesting each time it is the case. And we see that families take care of this social security. Somehow there is a kind of family tax. And to move from an informal system based with a tax, family tax, and to switch to a social security system, it's simple on paper, but difficult to implement. Guy Valencien, you're very well known as a professor in France. You've been very much involved in elaborating the health policy strategy. You were kind enough to attend this symposium. How do you respond to this? And what about the European perspective? It's a pleasure for me to be with you. And I created with friends a health house in Cynthia, Nimakunda. So I'm sure that our African colleague will be pleased. And it is not possible to globalize the system. It's not possible to undertake a major campaign on those topics. Those topics remain extremely regional and local. I'm convinced of this. And in Europe and even France, let me start with France. In France, we already have a system. Let me put it this way. We have the health status of your economy. You cannot have a health system which is efficient if your economy is not efficient. It doesn't make sense. And some of my colleagues went to Africa to offer surgery to small children with an open heart, and just after a few days, they were left so it's not possible. We wonder whether it's really useful or not. And we see that 75% of the social security expenses go to the elderly. So we have a significant redistribution to 1/6 of the population, and I agree with this principle. I pay for the others. For the time being, I'm fit and all the better. What I believe is that here again, we are too rigid in the organization of the system. We waste a lot of money. The system we have to pay for a medical act, okay? And we multiply the medical acts so that hospitals and clinics can get richer. So it's a crazy system. It does not fund the relevance of the medical act or the quality of the medical act, but it's just the fact that the act is accomplished. And we'll have to come back to this because and the OCDE said it, in the countries of the OCDE, about 20% of waste because the medical acts are not relevant, so 20%. And it represents for France 40 billion. And with 40 billions, we could improve the status of the elderly, more or less dependent, who we park in Lancet. Those hospitals were used for the pest, for the plague. And when you arrive in a retirement home at 85, you stay about 4 years and then you die at 89. So it's terrible. You have to revisit the age world. The elderly should stay in the real world. There are wonderful startup companies like ALBOUY supplying life aids in various homes. And this family, Cette Famille, is a startup company establishing a relationship with people having an empty bedroom to welcome the elderly because their children have left. So we keep them in the active life, and those who accommodate the elderly are paid to accommodate one person or two people if there are 2 rooms, of course, with quality control. And it's a complete revolution in the organization of the society itself, because in the years to come, we'll have 30% of old people. A majority will keep on working because we're going to postpone the retirement age. This horrible word, the retirement is horrible word in French, as if we were getting to the mountains to get isolated and die, whereas in Spanish it's jubilación, jubilation. So it's much nicer. And my African friend said that families are very helpful in Africa, and then you do not abandon the elderly in Africa. And to me, that's the biggest strength. And our African friends should not lose this while raising their social and economic level. You should keep this exceptional value, the relationship between generations. And I really wish that we keep as much as possible the elderly in the middle of the cities and not put them or park them in derelict castles in the countryside between chickens and pigeons, and they see no one. And I think that we have to completely revisit the architecture of our health institutions. They are hospitals or clinics, but in the hospitals, you should have health houses. You should have birth houses with midwives. You should put the houses of the elderly, but neighboring homes, and with student homes as well. The medical students would be delighted to have a free room and to be forced to spend half an hour, drink a cup of coffee or have a dinner with an elderly. So those solutions are extremely practical. No need to build up a huge mechanism or a very sophisticated system, but there are practical things which will enable us to better age and not be isolated. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And the young generations in France are ready. Strangely enough, there is no generation conflict. I was struck to see how many old people were accompanied by their children and sometimes grandchildren. When you were a student, 18 years, they were coming to help the grandfather too. So there is no conflict of generation. I'm struck to see that the young people like the elderly, and that's good because we wanted to do the opposite. We were in an industrial mechanism. It's ludicrous. The experience, the life to tell, that's wonderful for young people. Therefore, I'm very optimistic. And if we give the freedom to undertake those who want to have this combination of generations, this distribution in consistent architectures, it will be possible to improve the fate of the elderly. One of those days, they will become ill and will have to take care of. That's it. Thank you, Guy. Alexandre CALLENS, you are an engineer and you created, sorry, Destination Économie Durable. So Destination Sustainable Economy. It's a wonderful title, and you wanted to put forward a project linked to those presentations. The floor is yours. Yes. Good evening to you, François-Xavier, and to you all. Can you hear me all right? Yes. So good evening, and thank you, François-Xavier, for having invited me. And congratulations for the quality of the lecturers and speakers. COVID-19 is also an opportunity as well. The speakers or the panelists said it several times, there is an incredible need for investments, for funding. Each time at each presentation, they recalled that point. And to obtain these fundings, it is necessary to mobilize everyone. However, I feel that we do not rely enough on demographics and sustainable development. Sustainable development includes everything. A lot of topics covered by this chair, social and economic issues, environmental issues as well, and the social protection throughout the world, and demographics. So what would be very good would be to try and reconnect our expertise to the policies and to the citizens without reinventing the wheel. We have a very good example of citizen action on the climatic risk. It could be a source of inspiration. They created a group. Well, there's of course, the climate experts leading to agreements and so on, and a mobilization. Don't you think that the ideal would be to take this as a source of inspiration in creating the equivalent of this organization? It would be IPD, and the chair could offer our expertise to assess the economic and social impact and the demographic transition. And the IPD would be helped by other organizations as well for the environmental aspects. That's it. Of course, others wanted to have it before us, and what has changed? Why now is the atmosphere ready, or the climate is ready to obtain this equivalent of the IPCC? So we have to organize the involvement, the general involvement. But we could do more. There is a solution which can be described into one figure, and this is related to climate. When you look at the we move from 4 to 8 tons of equivalent CO2 per inhabitant per year. At the same time, the world population has been multiplied by 6. So the demographic development has been the main factor for this problem. 75% is due to that. And therefore, the creation of an IPCC is legitimate. What I would like to do is develop the theme of social protection within the demographic development. In this new perspective, we should be able to benefit from reconnection to the policies and a reconnection to the citizens in order to get financial resources and to globalize topics to benefit from the scale impact. I would say, so let's start with the developed countries. For the time being, they follow an individual approach. They try to finance social protection and to have a more robust system to be less dependent on the birth drop. Why this individual approach? Well, it's because this problem is quite acute and some countries would like to anticipate because they already suffer from this aging system. However, the efficiency ideally would lie in common tools to benefit from scale effect. We saw Denmark since 87 and Germany 2007 opted for a social VAT to better finance the social protection system in order to be less dependent on the announced loss of funds. Regarding the marginality of the results in Denmark, and in line with this objective, don't you believe that we may wonder whether this quasi-failure would come from the fact that we missed the opportunity to internationalize this topic, and the IPCC could do it, if the funding of the protection will be still a concern to us, and if we would keep the idea of sharing it between the activity and the consumption, I invite you to discover the idea of a societal VAT launched by the UFC Que Choisir, a consumption association, taken over by a former environment minister, and it is retitled VAT, societal VAT. If you try and combine the societal VAT and the social VAT, the merger of both is quite promising. This way, we could go beyond the limits encountered by the Danish and the German experiences or experiments, because the social VAT changes the paradigm. The purchasing power will no longer be linear, but will become flexible. And it would be possible to increase the rates, but it will be painless for the purchasing power. And then it would be a sustainable consumption effort. Since this VAT would be everywhere in the world, the scale would be wonderful. First, we could have a European scale, and then we could extend that worldwide. This way, the world would have a social protection. That's it. So let's maybe reflect upon it more collectively, and let's rely upon the past experiences. Thank you. I think we understood the quintessence of this message. It's a very good idea to create a kind of GIED or IPCD regarding the GIEC in French is IPCC in English, and it would become International Panel on Demographic Transition, IPDT, instead of IPCC. And this idea of Alexandre was put forward by Hector Villarreal and someone else some time ago. And I think this idea is quite interesting because even if it's difficult, and of course we agree with Yves, the solutions are first and foremost local, there's something here depending on structured international solidarity. We can say it's now we are in the 21st century, and there is a huge gap between some countries. The birth life expectancy at birth, the gap is 30 years. So we still have a lot of work on our plate to reduce the intergenerational tensions. Jean and Oliver, maybe you would like to respond to Alexandre's proposal, and Nathalie, you can share your remarks.
Jean?
Jean?
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think the question of global solidarity, it's a significant one. And I think that we've seen, I mean, the last decade was kind of remarkable in the economic growth that we had, and how really none of this went towards increases in measurable joint responsibility for social protection or health in the poorest countries. And I can't say that I'm terribly optimistic, given the kind of national politics that you have, that there's actually a constituency for that in high income countries. And essentially it involves redistribution from older populations to younger on a global scale, which is a little bit different, I guess, than what we've been talking about. And so for me, I'm actually more interested in some ways in the future of solidarity that's more maybe even disease-based, that if people, there's a big line in terms of feeling joint responsibility over health in general, but people have an identity around being affected by particular diseases, severe diseases, in particular cancers, type 1 diabetes, even sickle cell disease, diseases that affect children and whose parents.
Okay. Oliver, you want to react, please?
Yes, I think this suggestion, it has been on the floor for many years now. It's VAT is a good source of funding, and actually Santiago Levy, who was the vice president for the IDB, has proposed this for many countries in the region. I think it's now the time to explore not only at the analytical level, but going further and see what will be the steps needed to implement this. And also, I will say there is a huge element here, that is the political economy and how to implement this, and because it will require the redefinition of the health system and how it works, and links to the funding source. So I completely agree. We need to explore and benefit from our experiences and our analysis. And but it will be really important just to complement this with another with the correct incentives for the transformation of the health system. So even in France, we have seen many challenges trying to implement changes. So I think it'll be really important just to go there and propose the specifics, and I think COVID gives us that opportunity now. So for the coming years, we'll have this on the table of politicians and policymakers, and also from the ministries of finance. So it'll be really important just to crisp the proposals. So many institutions such as EGAP has analyzed this I would say, elements of policy elements that are needed to pay more taxes at the end for the funding of the state. So it'll be really important just to identify the nitty-gritty elements of it. Thank you, François.
Thank you, Oliver. Peut-être Nathalie, si tu voulais réagir à tout ce que
Nathalie, would you like to respond to what you've heard, if you wish so? Yes, of course. Thank you. Two main remarks to this interesting panel discussion. First point, recently I read a document of the ILO before hearing the presentation of Mrs. RAZAVI. And this document says that in the developing countries, there are gaps in terms of social protection, and it could jeopardize the recovery plans put into place for the time being and expose millions of people to poverty and precariousness. And those countries would not be ready for such a disruption. And maybe those on and off measures could be converted. These on and off partial solutions they put into place to fight against this crisis. They said they could set up a sustainable social protection system, or some measures put into place, such as the financial access or the grant of disease benefits, or the protection of income security, job protection. And this is in line with what we have said here during this panel. And it is in favor of this global disease coverage. This idea is very interesting. I said recently that 55% of the world population are not covered by the social insurance or by social assistance. So personally, this idea is very attractive, to have a universal global coverage, health coverage. But the question is how? How can we do that? And here we can conduct a lot of surveys or studies. But it's a very positive idea. And the second point, this idea of this IPDT, it's an excellent idea, that is to say, to create the equivalent of the IPCC, to gather all research works, all summaries of the labs in the whole world on the climate topic. Why not? Go ahead. Let's regroup all researchers and all works on this theme of the demographic transition and the aging of the population, the objective being, and that's what we've been trying to do at our modest level, to maintain this harmony between generations, especially given the crisis. So two excellent ideas we should retain here. Thank you, Nathalie. We are going to address this issue in the weeks, months, and years to come. Of course, the situation is very complex, but some countries really succeeded their health coverage to a large extent. Some Indian states launched a remarkable program, Thailand, Rwanda, and a portion of Southern Africa and Indonesia as well. Those programs are rather similar, revolving around competitive regulation systems and micro-insurance, and they succeeded in reducing the insurance gap, as we say. And this is very interesting, and we have to keep on working. We have to help countries, not necessarily through donation and transfer, but they should find, or we should help them find sustainable financing solutions and health architectures which are suitable.